And so from the time I read Dennis Johnson, I wanted to win the National Poetry Series. So
And you did.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Which is no wonder why I quit while I was ahead, right? Like, I mean, it was just this sort of like, all right, that thing that I thought was 8 million miles away just happened to me.
Welcome to the Times Arrow podcast. I'm your host, Alan Guy Wilcox. We are here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, at the home of Spencer Short, the poet whose work Tremolo, published in 2001, was a winner of the National Poetry Series. Great to be with you, Spencer. Great to track you
Great to have you
down.
here. Thanks.
Uh, we were joking, and the analogy doesn't quite hold, but for me, there was an aspect of searching for Bobby Fischer when finding you, because your poems in Tremolo, whether the collection was intended this way or not, but the effect of it certainly in the culture for young poets was a kind of call to arms moment where we said, who the hell is this guy? And it lit a fire, and it was hugely exciting. And, I bought this copy in the Vermont bookstore in Middlebury, Vermont, when I was, 19, and saw this selected by Billy Collins thing and said, okay, we're going to give this a shot. And then had my hair blown back. And it's a gift that keeps on giving, because there's a lot, one of the things we like to say about, in scare quotes, but great poetry is that it deserves to be reread. And there's a lot here to keep teasing out. So it's a pleasure to be speaking with you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Um, I think we can talk about certainly the poems in your poetic lineage and how it manifested itself in Tremolo, but also, like I kind of alluded to, you're a guy who is marching to the beat of your own drum, and unlike I think a lot of poets who might have received the accolades that you had, and then there must have been a strong initial pressure that you felt to continue publishing or continuing down a certain path. Did you feel that at all, or?
I think it was kind of the opposite. I mean, I was incredibly fortunate to win the National Poetry Series. That was basically my master's thesis at Iowa. I was still in Iowa City when I found out that I won. Um, and then, after that, it was odd. It was odd because I've never liked sending poems out, and so there wasn't a single. There might have been one poem in Tremolo that had been published in a journal before I won the National Poetry Series,
Wow.
and that was like an University of Iowa journal that a friend edited and asked for a single poem. And it will but shake and totter.
Oh,
The short poem, one of my earlier poems at the University of Iowa, was the only one I think. Boston Review, I took the bed bug variations after I won the prize before the book came out, and that was it. And so I was pretty confident in myself, probably in that way that young people who don't know better are confident. I expected to win something. I did. My friends were winning prizes. It was Iowa. I mean, which means what it means. We were full of ourselves. And at the same time, it happened. Billy Collins picked the book for the National Poetry Series. Billy Collins was, I don't know. I mean, I don't really have an analogy for him in American poetry, but he was the one poet people knew. It was a mixed blessing. Academic poets, avant-garde poets were dismissive because of that. People who liked Billy Collins read the book and they were like, this is not anything like Billy Collins. So like so that was odd. But I also had a couple other things happen. I ended up in a New Yorker article about bread loaf because I was there as a fellow. Then the New York Times Book Review published a full-page review. And kind of like out of nowhere, like all of these things that like you kind of expect to kind of be mated out over, the first 10 years of a career or the first 15 years of a career happened. And I think my realization wasn't so much pressure to keep going, but just kind of how utterly arbitrary it all was. I had friends whose poems I like better than my own, who were struggling to kind of get books published and, who ultimately never got a book published. They still have their manuscripts. And, I think that it was an odd moment for me. And poetry was like the only thing I did well. I was a bad student. and I got better over time, but for the most part, poetry was the thing that I could do well. And so when I got to the end of that and all of those things happened, it just kind of took a second for me to look around and say, what now? You know?
Just interested, bad student because disinterested or just mind elsewhere? How would you characterize that?
A little bit of all. I grew up in rural Maryland. I was fortunate in the sense that my father was a junior college history teacher. My mother worked for the school board. I grew up in a household that prioritized education without any pressure to succeed or anything like that. My parents were very hands off as I continually got B minuses and C's in all my classes. Um, but yeah, I think it was that. I mean, years later, I got diagnosed with ADHD. Years after that, I got diagnosed with bipolar 2 disorder. I did what I could. There was a lot of kind of like Rube Goldberg kind of like trying to keep everything going. School just wasn't that important to me. I wasn't impressed by people who got good grades. I didn't understand why good grades were important. Like, I like learning on my own. I like learning. I like classes. I certainly liked arguing back then. But the whole kind of I'm going to dutifully study and memorize all this stuff so that I can regurgitate it down the line never interested me. And it was only when I got to classes where I didn't have to do that that I kind of found my footing.
Well, your work in Tremolo and certainly in the new work that I've gotten a chance to look at has a series of perennial interests in excavating certainly the philosophical traditions. I mean, from Zeno and and the ancient Greeks, and certainly there's a strong streak of kind of the German idealism and etc. Present in your work, you're grappling with and playing with. So if you had to choose one or the other, I'm glad that you've brought that work to bear here.
There's very much a kind of a magpie effect in my poems, which is that I like scrounging for shiny things and bringing them into my poems. I've always liked that, and I didn't really feel like I needed to understand Hume or there's I think a half sentence that I cribbed from like Spivak. I think that there's all sorts of stuff in there that I kind of piece together from other places, and I wasn't so much I never felt any obligation to actually like have a deep understanding because what I was using them for was texture and as like rhetorical beats, as ways of like changing things up for my own voice, different registers. I was interested in all of that. And so I think that there's that element, especially in the early stuff. Now, not so much. Now I refer to things and it tends to be a little deeper.
Yeah.
There's an actual purpose for the things that I reference in my poems now in a way that wasn't there before. Which doesn't mean I'm getting them right. It just means that they're a little bit more. It's less of a magpie thing and more of a kind of like I'm trying to construct. I read a very influential book when I wasn't writing poems, and we mentioned this before the interview when I took a long time off from writing and reading poems. But I read a book of critical work by a guy named Daniel Tiffany, who's a really brilliant guy. And it was his first or second book. It's called Toy Medium, and it basically tracks, it sort of creates a lineage from very early materialist philosophy through kind of quantum physics, and draws a parallel to lyric substance. His thing is lyric substance. But the last chapter in it talks a lot about Richard Feynman's diagrams and how Feynman would make kind of non-literal diagrams to model incredibly complicated, difficult to observe things. And they weren't mimetic. They were explanatory in a way. And that I seized on that, and it became enormously important. Like when I realized when I was going to come back to writing again, that was it. Like I wanted to build models that try to get at something I can't get at any other way.
Yeah. Well, to come back to the Zeno line, that one really hits with the, it's ironclad kind of mapping of the dichotomy paradise as it relates to OkCupid and the era.
I was going to say,
So
yeah,
that's
it's
really,
in the context of
that's
online dating, right? Circa 2013.
what
Yeah.
more could you wish for?
Yeah.
No, it's well, okay. So there's a lot there that I wanted to ask you about kind of separately. The period of time where you stepped away from writing, I'm excited about getting to that. Certainly, you mentioned diagnoses, which are probably much more commonly recognized and diagnosed in today's world, not so much when you were a student. So, hence the Rube Goldberg devices. But to take it just one step further, I just didn't want to miss this opportunity. So, in terms of Iowa and the National Poetry Series, can you describe a little bit what were the mechanics of having Tremolo be submitted? So, it was your master's thesis, but then, I mean, were you guided towards certain channels? Were there people you worked with mentoring you that directed you that way, or how did you?
There was guidance provided. I generally rejected the guidance. It was an, I mean, it was, Poetry World in 1999, 2000, 2001, at the kind of advent of like widespread internet use, before small press publication exploded, before online journals were really a thing. It was still operating in a way that wasn't all that different from like the 1980s. And Iowa back then, and I think the changes since then have been really, really good for poetry in a lot of ways, kind of operated as a cultural gatekeeper for poetry. And you made connections, you got channeled into contests. I was not particularly comfortable with any of that, and so I basically didn't submit to anything anyone ever told me to submit to. And with Tremolo, I submitted to the National Poetry Series and Yale Younger Series, and that was it. That was all I submitted to. My memory is that I was actually I made it a decent way in the Yale prize. For some reason I remember doing well on that, and then I remember I was at the beach with my parents. I remember getting a message saying that I was a finalist for the National Poetry Series, and that was really just me kind of doing it on my own. I mean, I had people I respected, I talked to about poems, but everyone was very hands off with me at Iowa.
Mm.
I got very few suggestions for line edits. I got very few suggestions for anything. It was just sort of do your thing, and I did. And the National Poetry Series was the one I always wanted, and the National Poetry Series was the one I always wanted because it's what Dennis Johnson won for Incognito Lounge, and Dennis Johnson was the first contemporary poet who ever kind of took the top of my head off. And so from the time I read Dennis Johnson, I wanted to win the National Poetry Series. So,
And you did.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Which is no wonder why I quit while I was ahead, right? Like, I mean, it was just it's sort of like, all right, that thing that I thought was 8 million miles away just happened to me, and
So at Iowa, if there weren't necessarily, if people actually, it's what I'm tempted to call a Spencerian line. This idea of keeping something at arm's length. If there wasn't a direct mentor-mentee relationship, were there kindred spirits that?
I should walk that back a little bit. Like very early in Iowa, it might have been like the very first workshop I had. I had Jory Graham as our teacher, and it was an incredibly talented class. And the names in the class, like it was really remarkable. All of them have gone on to do really good stuff. And I had already done an MFA, so I was double barreling the MFA thing, which I justified because I didn't start writing poetry till late. I was almost 21 when I first began writing poems seriously, and I was 23 when I was at University of Michigan, which was my first MFA. And I finished there. I took a year off. I taught a little bit. I worked on a beer truck, and I was like, I need more. And back then, PhD programs really hadn't, like creative writing PhD programs really hadn't kind of like blown up. There was a Stigner Fellowship. There was a couple other things, but there just weren't a ton of options.
Yeah.
And I also wasn't aware, if there were other options, I wasn't aware of them. And so I thought, all right, I'll just go, if I get funding, I'll go do a couple more years and I'll polish up this stuff that I've been working on. And very early in my time in Iowa, you know, I got my first poem workshopped, and it was just like 45 minutes of just taking it apart down to like the cellular level. And, you know, in my memory, I always think of the Emily Dickinson sort of like closing line. Oh gosh, I'm gonna blank on it. Was it first pain, then stupor, then the letting go? And the letting go is the liberating part of it. And I realized what, you know, she was really taking apart all of the defense mechanisms I'd built into my poems, and requiring me to sort of directly engage with the world in a way that I was reluctant to. And so that was seminal for me. That was a huge deal. You know, so to say that like people were hands off isn't completely right. Like, you know, where they didn't need to edit my lines, they needed to actually turn my head around. And they did that. They did that. And as I, you know, advanced and, you know, got closer to finishing, you know, I had teachers who talked with me about a lot. And it wasn't to change my lines, it was just to talk about what poems are and why I write them, and whether I'm writing from the right reasons or whether I'm losing track of things that I should be paying attention to, the reasons why I do what I do. And that was, I think, for me, much more helpful than a line edit or telling me what prizes to submit to and stuff like that.
It's interesting. I'm going to ask about something else in just a quick second, but it's interesting, this concept of right reasons and wrong reasons to do something like write a poem, but quite an august group out in Iowa, especially during that time. So taking this, you know, down into the marrow, I guess is to be expected.
Look, the right reasons, wrong reasons thing, it was something that like I got in a way, in a very personal way. I mean, I used to, I think kind of baffle people when I'd tell them, you know, out at the Fox Head in Iowa City, you know, drinking with them, that like, I said, I was like, I love poetry enough not to write it. And what I meant by that was like, I loved what great poems did for me. And I had no real sort of drive to kind of write for a living. I wanted to contribute to that dialogue, and if I couldn't, I was willing to not write. And you know, that's a enormously sort of I don't know, it's either self-effacing or enormously egotistical. But it was a real feeling I had. Like, you know, what I knew what great poem was meant to me, and that was something completely different than, you know, trying to teach at a university or to publish to, you know, get tenure and things like that, which I kind of knew already I wasn't going to have a lot of patience for. And so the right reason, wrong reason thing, that matters to me, and it continues to matter to me. And having people to talk with me about that. You know, to have someone sort of look at something that I've written and you know, encourage me, you know, to say like, this is trying to be great. They didn't say this is great. They said this is trying to be great, and that was the compliment, that I was trying to do something big. Um,
That's the lane that you saw we're going in, if you're going to do it at all.
right, like it was sort of. I mean, it's kind of unfair to myself to make too big a deal out of that, I guess. But I think that there was part of me that just sort of, I wanted to insert myself into that. I wanted to insert myself into the stuff that I had, you know, read in anthologies, and that I had, you know, that kind of like dialogue, or the, you know, the, you know, Eliot's canon or whatever, right? Like, I mean, that whole thing in Tradition, Individual Talent, where he talks about sort of new writers being born of the canon, but also acting back to change the canon, for me was exciting. Um, and I liked being fearless enough to think I could do that. Um,
This is not dissimilar from Harold Bloom's theory of the anxiety of influence.
yeah,
In a
but
way, I
Harold
mean,
Bloom
it's a
like
different
annoys
angle.
me. So, but that's the thing. Like so many people who like I struggle with, I probably struggle with them because they land somewhere close to what I actually think.
Mhm.
And I'm very uncomfortable with maybe the core of the things I actually think. But yeah, it's a little bit like that, except that, I think that, for Bloom, I think it's been forever for me. So apologies if I get this wrong. Bloom was really talking about struggling with sort of like single poetic kind of forebears. And that's fine. That whole like productive misreading, I think there's probably some validity to that and stuff like that. But the seminal book for me was a book that I've probably on my 8th copy of it because I've given it away so many times. A book by a woman named Mutlukonic Blazing, who was a Brown. She was a Brown, and she. This was given to me when I was an undergrad, and I read it forever. I still go back to it. She divided poetry up into different lineages, and she focused on rhetorical strategies and not kind of like wrestling and misreading. In fact, I think in a lot of ways it was a rejection of like the Bloom approach, and it was something that was more like, let's stop paying attention to what people think they're saying and start looking at how they're saying what they're saying. And we can make connections between people we might not make connections between, and so you have a lineage that begins with Dickinson and moves through Hart Crane to Ashbery. And that's a weird lineage, right? You have a lineage that moves from Whitman to Pound to Frank O'Hara. Again, weird lineage, but but it makes sense when you actually start to get into kind of like what they're rhetorically, what they're doing. And that I think was super formative for me. But yeah, I think just wrestling with the past is a great thing, and wrestling with the past and aiming high and failing is really admirable. And I think probably in the back of my mind, I always just assumed I'd fail, but it was like, I want to fail on my terms. And that was, and then when I didn't fail, like at least initially, in terms of publicity, I think there's a lot of people who've read Tremolo who would say I failed in many, many, many ways. But when I didn't, that whole aspect of like, that aspect of it was in some ways deeply uncomfortable for me. The kind of commercial commodified aspect of it was more uncomfortable for me. I was much more comfortable in the kind of like necessary failure of, grand aspirations and whatnot.
It's, I think what you just mentioned was incredibly refreshing, especially considering people like Pound at different points publicly kind of disavowed Whitman.
Sure.
But if we take a look at maybe rhetorical strategies, et cetera, then we can find more than meets the eye. And I think it's also there's an interesting correspondence between certainly your old work and your new work. You just reminded me because also Icarus is an image that comes up occasionally, right, in the work. And there's actually if you're familiar with Jack Gilbert, has a
some, I mean,
yeah.
But not in a long time.
He likens in one poem about a failed marriage and to the idea that people forget that if Icarus is the failed marriage, he says people forget that Icarus also flew.
Right.
And that was the kernel that he was keeping alive in that poem about the failed marriage. In any case,
I feel like Gilbert's poem was much more serious than my poem about like salmon and. I mean, I'm not sure if I should say this out loud, but like, grad school threesomes, which is really how that poem ends. And it's just sort of like, and I think it goes back to kind of something that interests me now, which is like sort of finding like the kernel of authenticity in things that are on first blush inauthentic, finding the seriousness in a thing that seems glib, finding the glib thing in the thing that seems serious. Like, I mean, really trying to kind of like, say that there are no real coherent wholes. All of these things actually have their obverse, which is a word I use in that same poem, built within them. And that sort of thing fascinates me.
There's a kind of, well, you know, you're a lawyer now,
I am a lawyer
and
now.
I mean, a lot of the work argues both sides of a point, or will not, but it doesn't produce a feeling of equivocation. It produces a feeling of kind of thorough inspection, and trying to delineate what's BS from, as you suggest,
Sure.
what's authentic, what's real, what you can actually hold on to in this kind of, late century, late millennium morass of ICBMs and fiber optic cables and pool halls and Bill Clinton on TV and everything else. I think I just wanted to mention, because we can't know you and your intentions in any true way, but I think for when readers respond to work that they consider authentic, we get to bring ourselves to
Hmm.
it. And so, in the same way when, they say that when you remember an event, you're actually remembering the last time you remembered an event.
Right.
When we think of Tremolo, we also think of who we were when we first discovered the book, and that the smells and feelings of the late 90s, early aughts are all kind of like a sense memory that erupts out of that.
Like, I mean, they say, like, like the music that you fall in love with when you're 13 is the music that like stays with you. Like, there's like an age where things like click in and different things. And I think that poetry is probably not much different that way. So there's a lot of stuff that was really influential for me when I was first starting writing, and it's not just Dennis Johnson. Actually, it's kind of a weird combination of poets who I think were initially really important to me. It was Dennis Johnson, it was Robert Hass,
Mm.
Charles Wright, and Jane Miller. And frankly, finding the overlap between those four poets on a Venn diagram, it's there, but it's not necessarily, a big one. And, you know, in a lot of ways, none of them are people who I read now, um, for a variety of reasons. Not because I think they're, I've come to second guess my judgment back then. They were doing something then that I needed at the time. And their importance to me at that time is always going to be the most important anything was to me in my writing life, because they're the ones who made me serious about writing. They're the ones who pointed me in a direction. They're the ones who got the whole thing started. Um, and I think that's important, not to be dismissive of the stuff that you fall in love with first. Um, you know, uh, it, it- you know, in arguments about Billy Collins back in the day, you know, poets are elitists, and well, a lot of them would sort of call him middlebrow, and all of that stuff. And I was just like, but for a lot of people, he's their first poet. And that means he's incredibly important, because they're going to buy another book of poetry, and they're going to buy another book of poetry, ideally. And that means that he is the gateway.
Yeah.
And a gateway is nice. Like, you know, not many people, unless they have like, you know, a big brother who passes it down or something like that, like leap into like hardcore punk to start. They start with something that's a little more melodic, a little bit more poppier, and then they start digging into it. And I feel like, there's a lot of ways in which we we feel like we have to kind of like constantly reify standards. What's
Mhm.
good, what's not good. And, I mean, for me, like, I'm not even sure I can look at Dennis Johnson or Charles Wright or Gene Miller or Bob Hass anymore and think about whether do I think they're good? Do I think they're great? I, all I know is that like they changed my life. Like that's a big thing, right? Like that is enormous. And I say that and I like literally like hair stands up on my neck, because it's completely true. I was a lost person until I started writing poetry, and I, you know, did what I did because I had a couple friends who were peers who were also into it, and that helped me geek out. I had a teacher who mixed really, really great support with really terrible advice. I think you might have seen
Oh yeah.
the advice of poets, and you know, all of that is said with a great deal of affection, because it's like the fact of the matter is the thing someone tells you specifically is much less important than what it makes you do and how you respond to it.
You're making me think of the film The Matrix, only for the
Which
reason
I've
that,
never finished because I've fallen asleep in the middle of it like 3 times.
okay, well, that's an interesting film to fall asleep in. But there's a moment where I can't believe I'm bringing this up, but Ken Reeves' character visits a woman named the Oracle, and she tells him
I do understand
right,
yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
He's not the one, and the point there was she tells you what you need to hear, and I think there's a similar function happening there where it's not necessarily the content
Right.
of the message, it's where you are ready to receive some kind of message.
Right.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I mean, certainly, Charles Wright, Robert Hass, these are very distinctive and distinct poets. Charles Wright, I know, is not always everyone's cup of tea, but was also very influential to me in my reading
The
life.
World of 10,000 Things I carried with me everywhere. I bet my copy is still on the shelf over there, and it is like I spent summers beginning, basically the summer I began after I started writing poetry, working on a beer truck, and I would carry
Schlepping kegs.
schlepping kegs. Yes, absolutely. Which is a completely inaccurate use of the word schlepping, but whatever. My yeah. I guess that's Yiddish, and my Yiddish I just wasn't fluent. I was just like making it up. But then again, every language I've used in my poems, I'm making up because I don't know any languages whatsoever. I just completely roll with it. Which is why when I do readings and I have to read them like out loud, I'm like, oh, I'm going to butcher this. This is going to be so bad.
Right.
But yeah, like I carried it around and I took notes and and those were, I mean, in many ways, like the best writing years of my life. Like I was terrible at it. But I would like take my books on the beer truck. I'd get there 6 a.m. We get back at 4 or 5 in the evening. I would go home. I would shower real quick. I go right over to the University of Delaware Library, and I would work for a couple hours. Usually, like pop a couple ephedrine, which like you could buy at like a 7-Eleven back then, which was very unhealthy, and and I was deeply engaged in something for the very first time in my life.
Right. So,
And
what did you do when you were a teenager, if not writing poetry? And how did you mentioned there were some friends and some teachers, but was there a formative summer, or was this when you were 21 and that process really began in earnest? And you must have also gotten some kind of initial positive feedback loop, whether it was kind of personal or with others.
yeah, so I like the idea of being a writer when I was younger. I fooled around with some stuff every now and then. Um, I graduated. I graduated high school with a 2.6. I didn't get an A in a high school class till I was a senior. And
Better late than never,
yeah, and that was a gift, honestly. But and I got to, I was lucky to get in anywhere really. I went to James Madison. Um, did okay my first year. Then I got a 1.4 my second semester. I did okay my first semester. Got a 1.4 my second semester. Um, uh, was very lost in a lot of ways. My parents were threatening not to send me back, and I proceeded to, under that threat, rush and pledge a fraternity, which, as all young poets do, uh, and doubled my grade point average because other people structuring my time was clearly something that was helpful for me. But it's funny. I had a couple poems. I had a teacher for early American literature while I was pledging, and pledging meant I had my backpack. I had my pledging paddle in it. I would go sit in the front row, and I was operating on maybe 3 hours of sleep a night most of the time. Occasionally fell asleep in class. He was an old school kind of hippie-ish guy. I was like 9 layers of J. Crew and a pledge paddle in my backpack. But I turned in a couple. He allowed extra credit, and he let you. He was like, you can write poems. You can do creative writing for your extra credit type stuff. And I turned them in, and he was just like, I don't think you wrote these. And I'm like, I don't understand what you mean. And he's like, well, I've seen you in class. I've seen your pledge paddle. He's like, I've seen you fall asleep in class. I don't think you wrote these. I was like, well, I'm not going to try to convince you, like, honestly, whatever. and so even at that point, like I tinkered with it, I fooled around with it, but I wasn't serious about it, and I also wasn't really serious enough to stand my ground. Managed to kind of like talk my way into doing studies abroad. Went to London, and that was the first thing that changed everything for me. Up to that point, growing up in a small town in Maryland, poems were stuff that were in Norton anthologies.
Hmm.
Um, and there I was in the manuscript room of the British Museum looking at pages from Joyce, Bronte, John Lennon, whatever. And I could spend a day in there just looking, and then the bigger thing was like, going to Keats's house and being in Keats's house and like just realizing that these were people, and which is silly in retrospect because obviously they were people, but you're 20 and an idiot. You don't think of them as people. You think of things that are taught to you. And I had teachers there who really like, I mean, I was a mess and I was super happy. I was in a place where I could drink legally to excess. But I also was like clever and I clearly cared about writing in a way. And I had people there who liked what I did and kind of told me, you need to take this seriously. You need to do these next steps. And when I came back from London, I took my first workshop. And so I was, basically, you know, just, a couple months, like 6 months before I turned 21, like my first workshop. And that was it. And, the advice I got in my first workshop, I was really not, I wrote one good poem, and that poem I wrote seriously, I wrote in a like 102-degree fever of mononucleosis. It was about an Edward Hopper painting. Uh, but I remember my teacher basically saying, he's like poets are like, they're sort of like houses. Like the houses are sort of like their potential, and like where they are is like a room. And he's like, you're a very small room in a very big house. And he's like, there are other people out there who right now you think are better than you because they're like occupying many rooms in a smaller house. Um, and I did think everyone was better than me. I mean, uh, and so hearing that, like what I was doing, what I was failing at was actually the right thing for me to be doing at the time was important. And that was it. That was a trajectory right there. It was, you know, seminal events, incredibly important people, like just teachers of enormous generosity who took someone who was very messy and took them seriously. Um, I'm not sure that as a teacher, as much as I love teaching, I had that kind of patience or ability to kind of identify that. But in retrospect, like, I mean, I look at it and I'm like, I have no idea where I'd be if they hadn't actually kind of, you know, taken me aside and said,
Well, it sounds like at every point there were people who provided you not only, poetic nurturing and advice, but even more importantly, and this is also sounds like it was true in Iowa, kind of actionable steps
yeah.
to take, to pursue, to take what you describe as kind of messy and direct it towards something.
And honestly, it was never about like, what are your next steps in terms of writing a poem? There are some interesting bits of advice along those lines. For instance, like Jory had a couple things she told me I should do. The first was that she wanted me to write down 20 straight kind of linear descriptions of the physical world every day. Because what she got for me was that my poems were enormously interior. I wasn't doing that lyric thing of actually like caring about like the world. Like the poems were in my brain. Um, that never took. She was also the first person to tell me I should write in form. And I started flirting with that at the end of my time in Iowa. And now everything I do is in form.
Absolutely. Okay,
and so she saw that early, and that
that.
is, I mean, again, like mind-blowing kind of pedagogy for her to like look at me and not just kind of like be like, this might be interesting for you to do, but like actually you should think about this, right?
Well, your writing is very, I was gonna say musculature. It's very athletic in a way, intellectually, but also it's impacted. It repays dividends. There's a lot of, I would say, earned wordplay, because a lot of the, a sequence of, I think one thing you do really beautifully is to un- unpack etymology. This happens explicitly, but also happens implicitly. It happens within slant rhymes. It happens within certain resonances. And in bringing this up, I mean to point to the idea that then when you can turn all of that juice and energy into a villanelle, etc. I mean, there's now we can kind of see it all shine, um, laid out against the expectations that we already have for a formal poem. I did want to mention though that, uh, I think you mentioned that it didn't take, but I think that's something in Tremolo. The descriptions of the exterior world, when they blend with your interior world, they're some of the greatest lines in the book. I mean, we think about, you know the lawn percolating, or there. You have a great line about kind of, bugs winding up the night like a watch.
Yeah.
I mean, these things that ground us again and make fresh. I mean, not to resort to
No,
cliche, but
no,
they
you're
make
right.
fresh the mundane. You know what I mean?
I think about that all the time. Like there was a time, and honestly, I think it was cicadas winding the night like a watch. I think that's the same poem that has a line that says like, um, the wind settling in the trees like prayer into a pilgrim, which isn't really like a physical image, right? Like it's not like a natural image. It's kind of splits or straddles the physical world slash internal world type stuff. And but all those kind of date back. And frankly, those two lines might have been stolen from very early poems. They're like the only salvageable lines from an early poem. And I was like, all right, I'm not losing those. I'm going to bring them with me. Um, uh, that was a Michigan poem. That was one of the earliest poems in the book. That one that has the cicadas whining like a watch, and the pilgrims and wind in the trees. But there was a time when I was first writing poems where I would ride around in you know Cecil County, Maryland, where I'm from, in the truck, and I would just I would pay attention to the landscape. I would try to figure out how to talk about the landscape. And as time went on, I would agree that it was something that I tried, though a lot of the physical world stuff I described, I was actually just making up in my head. Um, but at a certain point, I was like, why am I doing that? Like, it might be a great line, um, but at a certain point, I felt like I needed to lean into and kind of embody my weaknesses. So, like, contra kind of like the advice to sort of pay more attention to the natural world, to stop mediating as much. My recent stuff is like, all right, well, what if I just sort of don't try to do in poems all the things that I'm actually not good at in life? What can I create a beautiful poem, or can I create a interesting poem that kind of has all the limits I have as a person? Which is a very
Mm.
personal project, and one set up for ridiculous failure, but also kind of thrilling, where you say, all right, like, I don't necessarily feel things on a typical register, and I don't necessarily pay enough attention to the world, and I'm a little glib, and I really like to mess around with like words. Hey, can you make a lyric poem out of that? And that's kind of my challenge these days. It's like, is there enough of a person there? Is there enough of a thing there to create like a compelling lyric poem?
Is it a feeling of? I mean, would it be correct to characterize it as a kind of a welcoming or an embracing of that part of the, not to use the word mess again, but that part of the jumble of things that make up Spencer Short,
I wouldn't say it's a welcoming thing or an embrace of it. I would say that it is a kind of, it's an attempt to build a bridge.
Mm.
Um, the fact is, I've always felt at arm's length from the world, and I think it is an attempt for me to sort of accept myself for who I am, and ask whether it's good enough, if it's enough. Also, frankly, to ask, like, because I've always, like, because I fail sometimes to register things and to do things in the way that seem to be sort of very easy for other people, that come naturally to them, to sort of like, can I figure out a way to let other people actually understand me in a way that I don't always let people understand me in day-to-day life? And all of that's very navel gazy. But at the same time, you know, it's also deeply personal. It's just personal in a way that's very different than like a Sharon Olds poem, right? Like, I mean, and that's, and one of, I think, the first things the big epiphanies I had kind of like later in time when I came back to writing was that, the formal choices you make are themselves expressive. You are expressing something when you choose a form. You're expressing something when you choose a very boring sonnet form. You're expressing something else when you choose, can I curse on our podcast? When you choose to fuck around with a very basic sonnet form. You're expressing something else entirely when you say, I'm so good that I can write a sestina and I'm going to make it rhyme, which I did at Iowa because I was full of bravado and a little hypomanic, which is really good for writing in a lot of ways, but also probably, a little synthetic. But all that aside, is like there are ways, I think, in which you kind of discover that, their expression comes in a lot of different ways, and it's not necessarily just like, your subject matter or how you're addressing your subject matter, or even necessarily what it seems like you're saying on the surface. Like, you can build things into your poems that completely unravel what seems to be the surface meaning of your poem. And I can give you a paradigmatic example of this.
Please.
One of my favorite poems of all time is Donne's The Good Morrow, right? And I'm not going to claim that it's Donne's best poem, but there's a thing that he does in it where he builds this sort of separate, idealized sphere, and over time lets the world kind of creep in. And at the very beginning, he uses a conditional that basically says, if ever any beauty did I see, 'twas a vision of thee, or whatever. I don't have it memorized. He comes back to the conditional at the end, and he says, if our two loves be one, it'll never die, right? And the conditional does two very different things. So we think about this as a poem of idealized love, except at the very end of the poem, he's created a conditional that's essentially a point of failure in the poem. And it's remarkable to me that you've got this, and it doesn't mean he's being disingenuous about his affection. It means that he understands at a linguistic level and a philosophical level that everything is provisional, everything is conditional. And, for me, like that, where you can actually have one thing on the surface and something entirely different underneath it is, and yeah, I got there because, like, a long time ago, I read a very neglected sort of like quasi new critical a guy named Earl Wasserman, who has a book on Keats, and he basically has this reading of Keats's Grecian Urn as a poem, kind of about failed transcendence, and the way in which the kind of like happy joy, etc., breaks the poem, and that sort of like attempt to sort of like actually transcend breaks the poem, and it leads to kind of like the death march to the altar at the end. This whatever, and so at a certain, I think to a certain extent, I began to sort of think of like, uh, this really fascinating kind of like failure, this idea of lyric failure, this Sisyphean idea of lyric failure, because Myth of Sisyphus was like my first book. Like, that was the first book that ever, like, I still read it every couple of years.
Camus' book.
Camus' Myth of Sisyphus. And that idea that, like, life is failure, fail again, fail better, and yeah.
But so we don't think this is fascinating, because in a way what you're doing and is correct me if I'm wrong, it's also placing you pretty squarely in a romantic tradition. And when we think of Wordsworth, when we think of Keats, when we think of their best work, it doesn't feel like navel gazing, although you can understand with the critique why that might be a critique. It pushes out and open, and actually sometimes the subject of failing to do so becomes the content that's explored in the work.
It's funny that we think of the Romantics, because to me, it's a very much an example of what Laconic Blazing was talking about, which is like if you talk about like Blake, Wordsworth, Keats, and Byron, Coleridge, whatever, like they're actually rhetorically, philosophically, in a lot of ways, going in very different directions. Like on a superficial level,
Right.
they were romanticizing a kind of like similar sort of subject matter, and they were doing certain things. But for me, like I see no Keats in Wordsworth. I see no Wordsworth in Keats.
Right.
I'm also just not particularly like deep. I'm not an academic. I'm not a specialist or anything like that. But for me, they all seem to be doing very, very different things. And, you know, I like that. But it also means that when we talk about romantics, we're not talking about sort of like an actual coherent idea of what poems do. I think, and I do think Keats is very, very different than especially like someone like Wordsworth.
I think that's totally correct. I think all I mean to say is what I do think they have in common is not necessarily poetic or a diction or even kind of project, but what it is, it's a reclaiming a kind of space that's free of intermediation
Right.
from an experience. And so I guess, but I take what you're saying, and I'm Spencer, I'm one stiff drink, and right, but I think in the new work
I'm
you
three
come back-
fingers gin, one finger tonic. I'm one stiff.
I should have, yeah. That's the kind of line that gets young poets fired up too. I think because there's excited to see what unfolds in the mind. I'm excited to see where this project goes. So Tremolo comes out. Let's just kind of hop across the lily pads quick.
Please.
Okay.
Yep.
Tremolo comes out to pretty much instantaneous fanfare, and you have to deal with also some.
I mean, we are talking poetry fanfare, right? So, like,
Sure,
I mean, it means that like literally 9 people in the
Okay.
country were actually paying attention at the time. But yeah,
That's fair. But yeah, that's true. But as a percentage of the population, probably even more so than now. Although that may have changed. I don't track these.
well, I mean, there were far fewer books of poetry back then
Yeah.
because the small press thing hadn't blown up. Like, I mean, the internet, all of that, which we talked about earlier. So yeah, and that's a complicated thing,
Yeah.
right? Like, I mean, it's interesting. You pay attention to music, and you'll talk to anybody. The difference between the aughts and now in terms of like indie rock is like, how do you make a living doing it, right? Everything is balkanized. Everything is free. All that stuff, and
Right.
the fact of the matter is,
free.
but the difference is really that if you like prior to the change, if you made it, it was much better, but far fewer people actually got there. And that's a very complicated thing, right? Because it's far more democratic to have a lot more people out there actually getting their stuff out in the world and having them all make less money. But if you want to do it for a career, do you just bank on being one of, would you prefer to be one of the few and take your risk and hope that you can actually, build something out of it? And I think it's a really complicated thing for a lot of the arts right now.
And a lot of poets become teachers, and you've taught, but you went to law school.
Right.
You mentioned with Jory Graham, she helped you work on kind of defense mechanisms or identifying, and
She helped me try to break down my defense mechanisms.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
I mean,
talk about Sisyphean task, that like breaking down my defense mechanisms is like, yeah.
But one imagines there's also something very precious there too, that you identify as something that you don't want to dissolve. There's a core of something that, I mean, we can certainly see the DNA of Spencer Short in the new poems. Pardon me, even though ostensibly it looks like a wildly different move on the page when you encounter it. But as you start seeping in, you say, oh, there's that humor, there's that voice, there's that. Is that cynicism or is that humor? Is that,
Right.
Is that an elegy or is this whimsy that I'm experiencing?
And the answer is yes.
Right.
And yeah, and that is, so Tremolo came out.
You're living where?
I moved to New York September 8th, 2001. Right. So I'm in Washington Heights. I'm there ostensibly straight from Iowa, but I stopped. I'd done like bread loaf that summer, and I had lived with my parents for a little while, and I was not young. I was very, you know, but my parents are very tolerant. And then I moved to New York, and I was living in Washington Heights, and the $800 rent was so extravagant that I split a 1-bedroom apartment with a guy I knew from Iowa, Rafe. Great guy, put up with a lot of bullshit from me. Um, and yeah, so I was there. I was like, I'm gonna do some literary parties. I'm gonna do some readings. I'm gonna just like, kind of do the New York literary thing for a little bit. Um, that lasted all of 3 days until 9/11 happened. And then New York became something different. And so I'm in New York. Uh, I met some great people. There were a lot of people. There were parties that I got to meet people who just are incredible writers. You're dancing to Stevie Wonder with Brenda Shaughnessy. You're like, you're in Tim Donnelly's kitchen, drinking cheap gin, whatever. Like that's, if you romanticize the New York school, if you romanticize O'Hara and Ashbury and stuff like that, like being in Brooklyn in that situation, it feels like it, a little bit.
Donnelly's one of my brother's favorite poets too.
What's that?
Donnelly is one of my brother's favorite poets. So yeah,
And
it
just
hits.
He's always been incredibly good to me. Tim's he's a good guy, and he cares about poetry in really great ways. And he also, I mean, he's got a new book out now, just coming out, I think. And the last one I think really kind of blew up in a way that was overdue. But yeah, so all of that, like, I mean, there was that, and that was fun.
But had being a lawyer, when did that first enter your
Right.
mind?
So
I mean,
first I have to quit poetry, right?
Okay.
All
Okay.
right.
So that's the sequence.
So I decided to bail in academia, right? I go on the market a little bit. I've got some demerits, in the sense that like I have a book, but like I have a little bit of an arrest record, and and I'm interviewing at these like I'm doing these like phone interviews at like 9 a.m. about these jobs in like the middle of like the mountains in New Hampshire, at these kind of like mid-level state universities, and I'm imagining some kind of like I go there and I'm I'm just like in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of winter, like trying to be a teacher in this world. And it was like, I don't know, like crossing the Shining and Lucky Gem or something like that. And I knew it would just be awful. Like it would bring out all of my worst habits. It would bring out all of the worst things about myself. And as much as I love the classroom, and there is no job I've ever had that I've loved more than being in a classroom teaching, um, I got it. Like the market was bad, and the slog was not something that was going to bring out the best in me. So I'm in New York. I start selling wine, um, and I do that for a few years, uh, and then I'm like, what now? And part of like the complete walk away was, and this is what I hinted at earlier. In 2002, it was 2002, might have been 2003. MoMA put on an enormous Gerhard Richter retrospective, and I had a friend in town. I'm kind of an idiot, and so I'd never heard of Gerhard Richter at the time. And I go with my friend Peter, good Peter Henry, is a poem in Tremolo.
Of course, yeah.
That's actual person, Peter Henry, who shout out to Peter, who's great, great, and super important to me in a million ways. I met him at Bread Loaf. He was someone who made me raise my game. I met him before Tremolo when we were waiters. We were doing the waitership at Bread Loaf.
Oh yeah, yeah, of
Yeah,
course,
and he really made me raise my game a lot. And he was in town, and he had friends, and we all go to MoMA. And I'm walking through this mammoth Richter retrospective, and it's like every room is like him addressing a new formal problem in a way that is an attempt to get at something about painting about himself, about the world. And it was clear to me that he was treating painting as a mode of inquiry in a way that I didn't know enough about the world to do. Um, and I knew that like at that, it really truly, it was like standing in the middle of that shit. I was like, I need to not write another poem until I think of what I'm doing on the page with the sophistication of this. This is another completely inevitable failure, obviously, but at the same time, I believed it. And I also got that like, you know, this idea that you have a voice and you keep kind of writing the same poem again and again and again, like that's not me. Like I want to, you know, if I'm going to write, I want to have a specific reason why I'm doing a specific thing at a certain time, and I don't want it to be because this is who I am as a poet. Like I don't want to ever be someone who says I write poetry because I'm a poet. I want to be someone who writes a poem because I have a reason I want to write a poem. I have a question that only a poem can answer. You know, and when I was briefly kind of editing a review, online review journal,
Which was what?
it was called Scout. I started with Kathy Ossip. And it was a great idea, but I was a really shitty co-editor. I was working at Skadden. I was just like, I mean, my life was a complete mess. Um, but I would tell people like the younger people who were writing reviews that I would edit with them. I was like, you know, I really want you to ask the question, like, what is this doing that only a poem can do? Why is this a poem? Why is it not a video? Why is it not a movie? Why is it not a sitcom? Why is it not a novel? Why is it not a short story? Like, why this? And none of them really like that question. But for me, it remains a really important question. And it's a question that animates everything I do. Um, and I have, you know, and I, you know, what I write these days, you know, I work with form and I do that stuff. And it's because of Richter, and it's because I'm asking myself sort of like, you know, what does it mean to interrogate the world in poetry? Like, why poems? Like, you know, I can write I could write an editorial. I could write a scholarly piece, I guess. I could write a law review article. I could do a lot of different things. Why a poem? Because poems are inefficient. They have tiny audiences. They actually foreground the inefficiency. They fight against every aspect of communication that we embrace on a day-to-day level for the most part, right? They are the opposite of shorthand. They are the long way around all the time, even when they're short. Because what they mean is never direct. And, you know, so you got to ask yourself, all right, so what am I getting at? Why have this thing? Why do this thing that has a tiny audience that's super inefficient that like, you know, and I feel like I have an answer for that when I write. And that makes me happy.
So let me ask you then,
Mm.
how much, because I think what you're saying is exciting, and I think there's a dearth of it out there in the universe, frankly. And so I'm inspired by the idea that you're being guided by to I guess to use this phrase, kind of approaching formal questions or approaching formal problems, these nodes, and tackling something different that is meaty, that you're going to approach in a way that's not just like sleepwalking through a discipline, sleepwalking through a routine.
But sometimes it's a little bit different than that.
Okay.
Sometimes it's actually about like, what if I adopt this incredibly intricate, self-imposed, formal like framework,
Mm-hmm.
and all I'm doing within that relatively intricate, formal framework is writing a poem that kind of seems like a normal poem. Like just nothing. It doesn't highlight the formal stuff. It doesn't try to break new ground. It doesn't try to take a new angle on father-son relationships or grandfather-son relationships or, you know, whatever. Like, what if it actually allows itself to be a little nostalgic, you know, a little bit kind of like, middle brow lyric type stuff. But what if it's achieving that sort of like seamless middle brow like stuff through this like incredibly difficult formal structure? And when I talk about form being expressive, that's a little bit of what I'm talking about, because life with like bipolar disorder, um, for me is a lot about things that some people find hard being kind of easy for me, and things that other people actually find easy being very, very hard. And it also means that I've never felt like a coherent self. And, and so that tortured kind of thing just to do something that is like seems easy for other people, like that's kind of the subtext of some of the things I'm doing. And I'm not sure that has any aesthetic value whatsoever, right? Like I'm not sure that saying,
vis-a-vis some kind of establishment that reifies certain
I guess I'm
writers.
just saying that, like, I mean, for a reader, like, do I want to, like, does it matter to me if, like, the end product is kind of middlebrow? That, like, all these, like, elaborate things had to be, like, gone through to get to this sort of middlebrow level? And I don't know the answer to that. But I do know that, like, the the effort of doing that
Mm.
for me is like not just expressive but mimetic of something that's very important to me, which is like the day in day out attempt to kind of like be a person, to be a
Yeah.
person when the things that that people sort of take think are natural to being a person aren't readily available. And that's I don't know, it's
Have you felt differently since you've been working on this new material? I mean, is there a moment when, I mean, I have to assume that poems cropped up across the years, time and again, or was it the off valve and then we reconstitute ourselves as a poet?
so I write. I can be super productive for a little while and then I'm done for a while. And it really kind of comes and goes. My brain is super noisy, and poetry, the stuff I care about that I've written, requires me to be dialed in,
Mm.
and my brain is not always dialed in. And that's just how it is, and it's okay. But it means that I kind of just have to be accepting of the fact that I'll have 3 or 4 really productive months, and then I might have a year where I don't have anything.
I think this, and I'm not comparing you to Mark Strand per se, but he said something similar about his writing life, and that I remember him saying in an interview that he won't write for 3 years and then he'll get a book done pretty quickly. And
I mean, it helps to be as handsome as Mark Strand.
or W.S. Merwin for that matter.
True, and
That steely blue eyes, you really.
never homely in the
He's
least.
the Paul Newman of mid-century American poetry.
But it's funny, like Strand. Like I mean, everything I know about him is that he was a good guy and stuff like that. And I remember like one of the very first sort of contemporary poems I ever read was when I was in high school, was "Keeping Things Whole."
Mm.
Um, you know, and when you're like 16, it just seems incredibly profound. You're 36, you're like,
Right.
but at the same time, like, I mean, yeah, Strand had a complicated relationship with writing. He did. And, I mean, I can respect that
Yeah.
a lot. Frankly, I think more people should have a complicated relationship with writing. Like,
Right.
It astonishes me that people are able to crank out a book a year or something, like, or a book every 2 years. Like, I can't imagine. And yet at the same time, my truly these days, my favorite poet, my desert island, like whatever, is Merrill. And Merrill wrote all the time.
Yeah.
And
His
Merrill
collected
patterned himself
works,
after Auden, right? Because Auden wrote all the time. And Merrill avoided actually writing all the time and having some of it be just like really awful, which there is a lot in the complete Auden that's just kind of like, poof,
Yeah, just skip.
But Merrill like keeps it together. Like, I mean, he's just remarkable. And it's very much kind of like the New York School thing, where I was like, such a fan of like the New York School because they were people who I could barely even imagine being. Like, Merrill and I have nothing in common, literally nothing in common. And I think that's why I love him as much as I do. I Yeah, I started reading Merrill because Jim Galvin taught a class on Merrill, and I didn't like dive into the class like head first. I just happened to buy the book for the class and kind of eventually get around to reading it. And when I did, I was just like, shit, all of this. I love all of this. I'll go back to Laconic Blazing. She's written
Mhm.
amazingly on Merrill. She has this book called I'm not gonna remember the name of it. It's like the politics of postmodern something or whatever. But it's like what she does is she takes people considered kind of like avant-garde and people considered kind of traditional and talks about sort of like how they're essentially working on the same thing. So like you're having Ashbery and O'Hara and Merrill and Bishop all in the same room and how they're all preoccupied with the same things and why these things are so important and why getting at them from different directions is all really, really important. And you know, through all of that, like Merrill just, yeah, I mean,
So is there a kind of migration that your work is taking that feels of a piece with that, where you're leaving behind some of the aesthetic concerns of Tremolo?
so there's stuff in Tremolo where I would like build these poems and then I would like end them with like a random thing I plucked from like literally anywhere. And I knew that I could get closure just taking a line from like a board game or like the cover of a book and make it have lyric impact, right? And I knew I could do that, and I did it because I could sell it tonally. As long
Right.
as tonally and rhetorically you are in that register, that high lyric register, you can get away with anything.
And it obviates the need for, or landing in a sanctimonious place at the end of a poem when you've dredged up a bunch of issues. It allows you to kind of float and lift up and be out.
I can go back a little while, little ways. When I was at Michigan, very briefly, Bill Matthews came into town. It was right before he died. I don't know if you know Ian Matthews or
Oh, I
not.
don't.
By Time and Money,
Okay.
his last major book. I think it won the maybe not like the National Book Award, but maybe like the Critics Circle
Yeah.
Award or
Yeah.
something like that. Um, and he came in, and I had the opportunity to introduce him to his reading, and I also got to meet with him for a while. He read my manuscript at the time, and what he said to me was, you know, you're working really hard to figure out what's relevant and what's not relevant. And he was completely right. Like my poems were literally sorting through the world to figure out like what matters and what doesn't matter. I had a very noisy brain and I didn't know what it was. And I was writing these poems that were like embodying that sort of confusion. And none of my other teachers at Michigan, like them all, they were great. None of them got that. Um, and he got it like reading my manuscript one time and like a, whatever. And so like it all kind of goes back to that thing
That's
where
still
like,
here. That's still very present in the poems, wouldn't you say?
it is the single thing that like define like that is the through line to everything from
I've almost
1996 to like 2023.
sometimes I think of you as a, and you forgive me because I mean this with all love and respect, almost as a custodian of different phases or parts of life, and you're kind of doing a philosophical taxonomy, and exactly as you suggest, kind of taking stock of its relevance, jettisoning it, or having a laugh on its way out.
But here's the problem. If you have enough tonal control, if you actually understand sort of like how a poem works enough to actually replicate like the lyric machinery of a poem,
Mm-hmm.
it dissolves the difference between relevance and irrelevance. And I got to a point
Mm.
where I did not like that dissolution. I didn't like that feeling that I could get away with whatever I wanted to get away with simply because I could make it sound like a lyric poem. And so a lot of what I do now, while I haven't got away from sounding like a lyric poem, is about it's a different animal underneath. Um, and again, we get back to the thing where like, what is the act of writing and what is the act of reading? And I can't sit here and say what I do now has more value to a reader than what I did before. All I can know is that if poetry is a way for me to interrogate the world and understand the world, what I'm doing now is better than what I was doing then.
Right. Well, readers, except for first-time readers of your new work, readers of your new work will have read Tremolo and will bring a certain amount of aesthetic expectation or the I mean, I hope, and I'm going to champion the new work as something that people should really look at with fresh eyes and be open to. But I think what we'll do when we'll read it is find the sensibility and and I think the humor, because that's that's something we love. I mean, that we and I don't think that it's not the same thing as just a pure, this is just a later Spencer short. It's there's a
I hope, I think, and I hope that like I'm very much in both of them,
mm,
and people who read Tremolo will hear the person behind Tremolo in the new stuff, even if the new stuff is actually kind of going in a different direction, right? And the confidence to kind of like make that break comes from something like, you know, the Richter retrospective,
yeah.
where it's like, be brave enough to do something radically different. Be brave enough to actually not give people the thing they expect, the thing they may even want, right? I've said, like, I mean, you know, in all of the sort of like ridiculous sort of like self-aggrandizing things that I've said along the lines of I love poetry enough not to write it, you know, um, I've always said that like I kind of like I like the idea of a poem where the people who hate it know exactly why they hate it, and the people who love it can't quite put their finger on why they love it. And you know, begrudging respect above all else is like for me, like, you know, that's it. Like I kind of know what I could do well, and I want to fight against that a little bit, for better or worse. And again, like I mean, it's sort of one of those things where it's like in some ways it's super shitty to an audience, right? Like I'm just doing these things and I'm like, hey, look at this, look at me like toying around on all this internal sort of stuff, and I'm like justifying putting out something that might not be as good as what I did before. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know, um but man, I got to be honest, like, and I haven't written in a while. COVID, 2 years of COVID, like living alone with a mood disorder, like broke me a little bit. You know, I was super productive for like the first 8 months of COVID, and then after 8 months, it was like, all right, like I'm gonna play a video game for 18 hours and pretend the world doesn't exist. But uh, but I do know that like when I write, it is like the purest relationship to poetry that I've probably ever had, because it's so disconnected from all the things that I kind of cared about when I was younger, understandably cared about when I was younger. But
Does story make sense to read?
story's fun, absolutely.
Because I mean, obviously, especially, you know, well, you got some late heavy hitters too, but I mean, there's so many other poems that one might think are the representative poems from Tremolo.
This poem is from Michigan, and it's from when I worked at the 8 Ball Blind Pig Saloon, and there was a guy named Lloyd who played pool, and there was a guy we referred to as a laughing boy. Um, the rest is probably some poetic license. Story. Lloyd shoots pool like he's standing in a puddle being prodded with live wires, all spasms and twitches. In Geneva, no. In a movie, in sepia tones and subtitles, a man and woman in Geneva share a small glass of pear brandy. Someone else has lost her dog. And here, where the red lights are cast down like eyes demurely, like a face blushing, laughing boy is chuckling to himself in the corner or staring at the jukebox, a tiny web of saliva in his beard. There are intimate questions assailing the world like tiny pebbles of hail. Someone whispers, I love you, in a dark room, but he might as well be shouting more light in 19th century Weimar or asking his cabbie where the ducks in the park go in winter. One morning, X is standing there in a gray scarf, backlit by the window. The next, she's in Colorado, dyeing t-shirts at minimum wage. What I'm trying to say is, after she left, everything I did was like wading through hip deep water, learning to love everyone and no one in particular. Things change so quickly. For instance, you're walking to work. The sun seems unusually bright off of the tall office windows. You are wearing a thick wool sweater, and still the cold stings your ears, wraps its hands around your neck. Later, sitting at your desk, you look up. It's mid-afternoon. You're sweating. Outside, the sound of a landscaper's shovel could be the first bite into a good apple. And then it's spring. But this is not spring. The entire town smells like dog food. The day seems so sad. It can't even heft its own weight. There's work to do today, it says. But why? So this is from, it's an overarching kind of thing, and I think it's going to be, in my mind, it's going to be the centerpiece of the poem. It's called, the overarching thing is called Anagrammer. This is called How to Spot a Fraud. You've seen How to Spot a Fraud. Yeah. It does some stuff that I like. It owes a little bit to a Merrill poem. And frankly, I think it was an unpublished Merrill poem, like book-wise. Because James Merrill's father was the founder of Merrill Lynch, right? And maybe the poem is Economic Man, and it's in his collected, and it's an astonishing poem in a lot of ways. But it also actually sort of talks about economics in a way that poetry doesn't often talk about economics. And I give a shit about that. All right, but this is called How to Spot a Fraud. 40 floors above the rabble, clouds consort, iris level. They've ambled in from God knows where to brush their ample flank against the dreary millet of Midtown West. Below, blocked off Broadway, forlorn child of show and tell, splits the difference, if one exists, between NASDAQ, Disney, Guy Fieri. I've been backfilling case sites, putting details in the devil. Umbrellas burst west to east, like time-lapse poppies in a field. 6, sapphire and gold. Riviere, the neon Citibank. Buyer beware. The bat-like black ones dangling over knocked-off Fendi scarves and bags will leave you wet, cure your innocence. Less waterproof, you might say, than now discarded theory or flyweight alibi. One headwind and the fuck truths revealed. Not every con so quickly fest. Yesterday, at the behest of Behemoth Bank, a division of Cthulhu Co., I spent my day forging through florid groves of Bloomberg chats between frenzied traders of CDOs. Say what you will, but I'll give them this. They see value in the derivative. Or did, I guess. Then they built McMansions on the permafrost of our collective debt and panicked when it began to melt. When the rain redoubles, flocks take flight toward the Klieg-like glow of open-armed H&M, its aisles wide and fashion fast, or Speediverse, the yawning gap where once stood a grand hotel. Supermen have packed their pecs, padded off, left behind, votive, restless, one ersatz Elmo, who stews inside his blood-red pelt and keeps unlicensed watch. The omens arrive, quadruplicate, traffic stalls, the air grows close, and time, archaic, archival. Just past the high-rise, high-res gauntlet of lifelike LED, the AMC Empire's carousel marquee, all is lost. An A-list star, soundstage sees, but not Elmo, not just yet. He lingers on, mid-square, a pinprick, a drop in the bucket.
Thank you for watching. If you'd like more literary content like this, feel free to hit the notification bell, click like, and if you want to enact your own literary adventure, check out our reading platform on timesarrow.org. Thank you.